Welcome everyone to our Global Public Health Workshop on Decolonizing Global Health. Thank you all for joining us. This workshop is part of an ongoing series that we're putting together for students and trainees around the world. My name is Deepika Khanna, and I'm currently a third-year medical student studying at the University of Illinois College of Medicine in the Global Medicine program. I'm the current chair of the Trainee Advisory Committee at CUGH. Currently, I'm located in Chicago in the United States. So just a little information about the Trainee Advisory Committee. We are a group composed of 25 students and trainees around the world. Each person applies to TAC, which is what we call it, and serves a 2-year membership role, serving on internal committees within the TAC and also on external CUGH committees. We have many projects going on throughout our membership, and we also have applications opening up very soon in September, and it'll be open for a month. Some of the requirements for joining TAC, if you're interested, would be that you are a student or trainee. We welcome all fields of study. Outside of public health, medicine, we welcome all fields. And it is a requirement that you're either an individual member or an institutional member of CUGH in order to join. And applications, like I said, will be open soon. And if you are accepted to TAC, you would serve 2 years on the committee. And also under the Trainee Advisory Committee, we have something called the Campus Representatives Program. Some of you on this workshop right now are campus representatives. So we have people serving as campus representatives from all over the world, representing their institution that they're studying at. We also welcome faculty of those institutions, basically serving as a liaison between CUGH and their institutions, and also having the opportunity to be involved in various projects, both with TAC and also other CUGH committees. So we're very excited to have this workshop today. Like I said, this is part of an ongoing series, so you'll be able to hear more from us about any upcoming workshops that we have. I'll now pass it over to my co-moderator, Jeanette, to introduce herself.
Thanks, Deepika. Hi, everyone. My name is Jeanette. I'm a bachelor student in public and global health at Cayetano Heredia University in Lima, Peru. I'm currently doing my thesis about the impact of quarantine on patients with schizophrenia.
So I'd like to take a few minutes to introduce our 2 speakers for today, Professor Quentin Eichbaum and Professor Judy Caniola. So Professor Quentin Eichbaum is a professor of pathology and medical education at Vanderbilt University, where he directs several education and clinical programs, including in global health. He was born and raised in Nambia, graduated from MIT and Harvard Medical School, and does extensive medical work in Africa, especially with new medical schools. Professor Eichbaum will address the topics of decolonization from the perspective of a personal narrative as someone born and raised in African colonies, and from the perspectives of global health education and the need to rethink global health partnerships and to decolonize the mind.
Okay, now we're gonna introduce Ms. Judy Caniola. Is an heir and the chair of the Center of Nursing and Midwifery at the University of Global Health Equity in Rwanda. She is dedicated to the development of nursing and midwifery and the improvement of healthcare for the peoples of Africa. Ms. Caniola will discuss how there is a need for a different health education system in Africa, one that is based on human dignity. She will also touch on the challenges of global health education, discuss how we can train decolonizers, and design what meaningful engagement looks like.
So before we begin, or before we move forward, I just want to comment on how during the presentation, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A section that should pop up on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And then feel free to use the chat to sort of interact and engage, but make sure you direct all questions to the Q&A so we can get to them at the end of the presentations. I will pass it now on to Professor Eichbaum to speak a little bit on the CUGH conference.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I am going to talk a bit about CUGH since I'm a board member and sit on several committees at CUGH. Just to tell you a little bit about the organization, it's the one of the largest, if not the largest, academic global health organization in the world currently, with about 184 institutional members throughout the world, 31,000 global health practitioners on the network. And in the last year, we've had about over 12,000 participants in various events that we've organized. CUGH and its mission statement supports academic institutions and partners to improve the well-being of people and the planet through education, research, service, and advocacy. It's a very vibrant organization, lots of subcommittees, and lots of scope for participation at every level. Just to alert you as well, please to consider joining the conference next year with 2022 in Los Angeles, April 1 to 3. There are several satellite sessions before that during the dates of March 21 to 25, in person and virtual on another date. Please consider those. Here are the breakout times for the various submissions of panels: August 31, abstract September 13th, and the deadline for satellites is December 15th. So I will go in right away and start giving my talk in the interests of time. We're 6 minutes after already. Decolonizing global health. How did we get there and where do we go from here? So I think it's important to keep in mind that colonialism isn't something that just happened a long time ago over there, but that we actually are ourselves colonizers. We colonized the New World, and we colonized America and South America. We are actually sitting on land that was owned by other people. But even more importantly, decolonizing has other social ramifications in the United States. And we've all witnessed the Black Lives Matter, the systemic racism, social justice movements, diversity, equity, inclusion. But I think it's also important to realize that the historical context of these movements are all fairly different, and that we need to examine these and distinguish how they're different. I don't like people saying we need to decolonize our diversity, equity, and inclusion program. That's a different set of historical context, so beware of that. What we should realize, however, is to ask the question, who is decoloniality for? And I think that's an important question to ask, because sorry, my slides are moving around a bit. The global north still shapes the narrative, brings resources, and sets the agenda. However, the global south has the lived experience and insight of coloniality, but they are as yet not fully defining the agenda. So we need to be careful who is doing what in this debate. Who should drive decolonizing, the global north or the global south? We absolutely need many more voices from the global south and their participation in framing the debate. Would I ever stress that the global north has its own critical, reflective, and reparative work to do, and in a slightly different context. And I'm going to give you my story why I think this is important. And I'm always reminded, having grown up in Southern Africa, of Nelson Mandela's statement when he talked about white South Africans under apartheid and said that whites are prisoners of their own consciousness and history, and they need to unprison themselves. And so to speak, the global north also has a role in decolonizing itself. So I'll give you my story here, my twisted colonial story. I was born and raised in Namibia, which was formerly Southwest Africa, in this little corner of Africa. And how did I land up there? My father was of Jewish descent and his family escaped Nazi Germany in 1937, which was becoming a big colonial power and was formerly a colonial power in Africa. And so he came and eventually landed up in Namibia, which was called Southwest Africa, where I was born. My mother was a British descent, a big believer in the British Empire and Queen Victoria. So I had a pretty conflicted upbringing in colonialism, one parent believing it and the other one not. In any case, Namibia, Southwest Africa, was colonized by South Africa, so to speak, after World War I. And I was conscripted into the military against my will to go and defend Southwest Africa and Namibia against invasion and liberation from the people situated in Angola. But this is where the story gets very twisted. I only found out recently and this shows our history is so important in the colonialistic debate, that Namibia, Southwest Africa, was the site of the first genocide of the 20th century. That had been very effectively hidden from people, and the Herero tribe was completely wiped out almost by the German colonialists. Now you may say, well, so what? But where the story comes full circle is that the people who laid the foundations for the genocide in Namibia, and the word Vernichtung, which means annihilation, all went back to Germany and became the founders of Nazism. Hermann Göring's father was an administrator in Namibia. Von Epp was Hitler's right-hand man, was in Namibia, Southwest Africa, who started the genocide there. And Eugen Fischer was a big race theorist and laid all the foundations for eugenics in Nazi Germany. Started in Namibia with these heads of the Nama and Herero tribe, which only now being returned. These skulls were sent to Germany, and people would have the skulls of the Herero tribe on their mantelpiece as ornaments from the genocide. And now Germany only this year agreed and apologized for the genocide that happened more than 100 years ago and agreed to pay reparations. We come full circle. Colonialism has had repercussions beyond what we have thought it actually has. So let me go into how this happened. And my focus is mostly on Africa, because that's where I was raised. Things came to a head at the Berlin Conference in 1884-85, where Bismarck, the German chancellor, called a meeting of all the colonial powers, ostensibly to decide how to allow free trade and divide up the territory, and ostensibly to abolish slavery, which never really happened. Africa was divided up among the British, French, Germans, Portuguese, and this is what the continent eventually looked like, cut up like a cake. The myths that sustained this colonialism for the European powers were, number one, we are here to help, teach, and humanize. That was a total myth, because Africa was raped and all the wealth was taken out to Europe and the New World. Who's helping who? Ask that question in global health today. Who is helping who? And as Angus Deaton has said in his book, The Great Escape, the rhetoric of colonialism was all about helping people and bringing civilization and enlightenment to people whose humanity was far from fully recognized. This may have been little more than a cover for theft and exploitation. That is what colonialism was doing. Myth number two, the West brought culture and written languages to the colonies. As Ngugi wa Thiong'o in his seminal book, Decolonizing the Mind, has written, for colonialism, this involved the destruction or deliberate undervaluing of a people's culture, history, education, literature, and the conscious elevation of the languages of the colonizer. Africa had over 2,000 languages. Today, what do we talk about? French West Africa, English-speaking Africa, maybe Portuguese Africa, a smattering of old German Africa, but those languages are buried through colonialism. Colonialism myth three, and there are many more than just three. Prior to colonization, Africa was a dark, empty continent devoid of democracy and enlightenment. This is complete nonsense. It's not just Egypt that was a remarkable and is part of Africa civilization. There's Mali and there's Ethiopia and Southern Africa where democracies were thriving. And there were remarkable African intellects at the time of Locke and Hume and Kant who were equal to them in their writings. But the legacy and impacts of colonialism are the following: dispossession of the land, theft of resources and minerals, depersonalization of Africans, imposition of European languages, and the stunted growth of African culture, science, and humanities. We move to the neo-colonial period, which we're in today, the ongoing exploitation of African resources and land. The iPhone, which you may have right next to you, may be looking at right now, is highly dependent on these minerals taken from the Belgian Congo. And it's not only China, but many other countries are raping the minerals of Africa still today. The fracturing of African personal cultural identities, which has led to ongoing conflicts. And when the colonies were liberated, they were very poorly prepared for democracies, which explains a lot of the dysfunctional states of these colonies today. But let's not think that medicine was a good player in all of this. Medicine was complicit in colonialism. Doctors were agents of colonialism. And as the French administrator Lyotet says, the only excuse for colonialism is medicine. What ennobles and justifies the brutality of colonization is the action of the doctor. the most effective of our agents of penetration and pacification. And a lot has been written about this. Medicine served colonialism. Not only was it there to further imperial conquest, medicine was there to find treatments for colonial troops and for the slave workers to keep them alive and working. Research was used to discover why the colonial troops were dying at much, much higher rates in West Africa, for instance, than the local people. And the European powers were very scared of their colonies bringing infectious diseases back to Europe. And the cholera epidemics were, for instance, blamed on the slums in India. So medicine played a big role in sustaining colonialism. What do we land up with today? This is the legacy of colonial medicine, where the healthcare workers are still in the global north, and the distribution of healthcare workers in the global south is minimal. And this is the context in which global health is practiced today. So what is global health and what is its mission? It's basically a Western construct, the word, that came into vogue around 2000 when I was a medical student. But there was an insidious, seamless transition in terminology from colonial medicine, which, as we just said, the myth was to help the people. Missionary medicine, where religion came into it as well, to help the people. Tropical medicine. International health was the term when I was a medical student, and now we have global health. Has the mission changed very much from helping medicine people here to what we are doing now? A question we need to ask. The ironical contradiction in all of this is global health emerged out of Western colonials' global supremacy with an ostensible mission to mitigate health inequities globally. Ask, is it fulfilling this mission today? And here are some of the metrics that I like to contrast between colonialism and slavery. Slavery was still around during colonialism in many parts of the world, and global health. Under colonialism, slavery asked how many slaves, how much cotton, how much rubber, gold, diamonds are we getting, how much land did we acquire? The Germans wanted what's called living space or Lebensraum. How many converts to Christianity for those who saw colonization as a missionary project? But in global health, what are our metrics now? How often do you hear people, how many countries do we work in? We work in 30 countries, you only work in 10. Why does the number matter? How many grants do we receive? Who gets the grants, the promotions? How many students did we send to them? Is this by FedEx? I ask facetiously. How many papers published? Who are the co-authors? How many trainers trained? Trained for what? By whom? How's the training sustained? How many clinical trials completed? Under what ethics? To whose benefit? We need to ask those questions. So the way I like to think of decolonizing is basically under two broad categories. There's structural decolonization and cognitive decolonization. Structural, I think of in terms of partnerships and foreign aid and the metrics I just mentioned, all those checklists of how many people we're sending, etc. The trickier one to me is cognitive decolonization. And this I take from Ngugi wa Thiong'o's book, Decolonizing the Mind. Can we decolonize the mind? Critical self-reflection, awareness, rethinking. There's a bit of overlap that I'll get to as well between structural and cognitive, which comes into medical education. I wrote a paper in academic medicine, which was written 2 years ago, but only published this year, which we went through several ways to decolonize partnerships, emphasizing patient safety. You can read the paper, we can send it to you in the chat perhaps. Fair trade principles to education programs, developing global health curricula, addressing power dynamics, equalizing access and opportunity. There's several rubrics that we look at that may be quite helpful for you, those of you who are interested. I don't have time to go into this, but happy to send it to you. Another part of structural decolonization are research partnerships, huge power asymmetries, the 90-10 divide. 90% of global burden of diseases is in the global south, but only 10% of funding. This is where all the funding and the publications are happening. And this is the playground where all of this is taking place. What we do need to ask in terms of structural decolonization as well is a very thorny question. Partnerships based on global health. And as the author of this book, Joanna Crane, Scrambling for Africa, says, since the waning of the colonial era, relations between African nations and the West have been increasingly defined by the politics of aid and development, in which North American and European countries serve as donors to impoverished, formerly colonized client nations. Now, one may say, well, you owe it to them, and there's nothing wrong with that. And it's a very complicated debate. Bill Easterly and Angus Deaton have weighed in on this quite heavily. Are we just buying our way out? Foreign aid can actually perpetuate colonialist traps. As Deaton says, we now think of aid as good to help others, but that view is too simple, too ignorant of history, and too self-congratulatory. Foreign aid makes governments less responsive to the needs of the poor and thus does them harm. I wish I had time to explain that, but there are many examples of that happening. The second one is cognitive decolonization. Can we do it? Can you decolonize the mind, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o put it? I'm of two minds here, as a pun. I think not fully. I think we're up against some pretty heavy evolutionary biological constraints, cognitive biases, confirmation bias, which is group adhesion, which we see playing out all over North America in your political affiliations, but it's very ingrained, as are belief systems, cultures, tribalism. But we have to try. We have to try through cognitive approaches, which means teaching critical self-introspection and consciousness, making people aware of cognitive biases and how to de-bias a controversial topic as to whether that's feasible. We need to teach history differently and more transparently. Africa has a pre-European history. We need to know what really happened. I only learned recently about the Namibian genocide. Why was I not taught that earlier? Why was the Tulsa massacre so effectively hidden and only come out in the last couple of years? We need to deconstruct the Western intellectual canon. Our revered intellects, the racism in the writings of Hegel, Hume, Heidegger, Jefferson has been seldom exposed. And then there is, of course, global medical education, which has a bit of structural and cognitive. I think it's structural in the sense that there's medical school standards, accreditation, and it's cognitive in the sense that what we teach influences students' minds. But Alan Bleakley, and I apologize for quoting so much Western writers, just simply because that's people who've written most of the books until now, unhappily. Alan Bleakley has said, what does it mean to be a medical educator who may unwittingly be colonizing an other with patently Western ideals and practices? A rhetorical tactic that serves also to construct the identity of the colonizer. What are we doing in medical education by setting standards around the world? And by exporting our medical curricula to other countries. We need to be cautious of that. I'm a believer that the humanities need to be brought very fully into this debate. It should not be left up to only, and there are complex reasons that Eugene Richardson brings out why epidemiologists are not the people who should only be doing this. And the humanities are critical in this because the humanities serve as a democratizing agent, as Martha Nussbaum says in her book, Not for Profit. They teach us history, they teach us how to deconstruct concepts, critical thinking, they're about the social sciences, anthropology. As Bleakley says, the arts and humanities are given a central role politically in democratizing medicine, where they also educate for tolerance and ambiguity. The humanities need to be part of this debate. And I've started at CUGH, a Global Health Humanities group, to start thinking about some of these things. But we do need to be very careful. Whose humanities are we talking about? It's not the Western canon. We need to be very cognizant of other ways of knowing, indigenous knowledge, epistemic humility. What can students do for decolonization? And that's a tricky and complex question. I think you certainly need to reflect on your role and complicity in global health. Why am I doing this? Is it adventurism, saviorism for my CV for medical school? I would say we need to move away from these short-term experiences in global health and consider longer immersions. If global health survives decolonization, as I'll say, you need to engage appropriately wherever you are. Self-education and engage in critical self-reflection. I think this is read to understand history, cultures, and context. When I've asked students, what was the Berlin Conference of 1884 about? Very few have heard about it, and that is critical for the decolonization of Africa. You need to understand critical concepts in race theory, othering, symbolic violence, educate yourselves. Here's a host of books, some of many, many more, and I'm happy to send you the list. So here's a critical question. What would a decolonized global health look like? As Abimbola and Pai have said, will global health decolonization? Academic institutions in the global south should be as influential as the global north. There needs to be mutual learning, not just high-income country dependent. Expertise flows from the global south to the global north. We need critical allyship. I think that's Cynthia Nixon's term. High-income practitioners are allies, enablers, not just leading the show all the time. Knowledge platforms need to be decentralized and democratized. Health should be seen as a global and local right with respect and humility, replacing just the desire to help othering and saviorism. And I will end here with a question for the students. How do you see your future in global health, especially with the pandemic that has so completely disrupted it? And a very important question that Abimbola Pai posed: if the future is a radical transformation, then decolonization should obliterate global health. That might not be a bad outcome. This should give you a lot of pause for thought. So thank you very much. And I hand over now to my esteemed colleague, Judy Caniola. Judy, are you ready to share? I'll stop my share.
Thank you, Quentin. I'm ready to share. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning, wherever you are. I'm going to just talk a little bit about decolonization. Quentin has really set the ball rolling on a lot of the things I'll repeat, and has actually made my work so much easier because he's spoken, so passionately about some of the things I'll touch on. I'm really just going to give my perspectives and my experiences living and born and living in Africa, working here, my role in nursing and the nursing and midwifery profession, and now as an educator. And by no means am I even attempting to say I'm an expert or that I have all the knowledge, but sort of just bringing thoughts to the table for us to mull over, think about. And this discourse is very good to have, because I think this is the beginning of even what Quentin has just mentioned, obliterating the global health, so that we actually see a meaningful engagement and in this sphere that we are calling global health. My name is Judy Hanyola, as has been said before, and I'll just quickly go into it and really just bringing thoughts to us to chew on, think about, and focusing mainly my discourse or my discussion around, education and education system. So in Africa, our health education system, like Quentin has alluded to, has been inherited from the colonial Europeans, the British, the French. Sorry, I'm having a challenge with these. Yeah, okay, sorry. Yeah, thank you. The British, the French, Spanish, Belgium, Portuguese, Dutch, all of these who came and, as Quentin said, sort of scrambled and cut Africa into pieces. We then inherited an inherent biomedical model that then focused on diagnosis and treatment, based often on a Western scientific understanding. And what this did is it just completely undermined Africa's ways of knowing and doing. And as a result as well, then, the colonial education system was different in every country. So from my own country, Kenya, where I was born and went to school, we were a former British colony, very different from next door, for example, here where I am now in Rwanda, which was colonized by the Belgian, and even Tanzania at some point, which is our neighbor, was colonized by the Germans. Quentin has mentioned about the Herero in Namibia, Southwest Africa, colonized again by the Germans. So even this colonization also then further fragmented the education, and each country then inherited a completely different education system. Then Africa also faced other compounding factors that have then gone ahead to further pull apart this education system. We have a lot of financial conditionalities placed on Africa by the economically richer global north, which further reduces the economic capabilities of universities. When I went to school in the 90s, I remember at that time in Kenya, the IMF imposed what they were calling structural adjustment programs, which then had an impact in a lot of things like absorption of health workers. So when we qualified as nurses, as midwives, as doctors, as pharmacists, they came and said, no, there's a freeze on hiring. So you find that you've gone to nursing school, you've gone to medical school, and you come out and sort of like there are no jobs, not because you're not needed. You can imagine how much Africa would need a health worker, but by some convoluted thinking and process, we can't be paid because some other factors have come into play. Our curricula and textbooks have been outdated and inherited again. Often, I remember when I went to school, the pictures, like in our Margaret Miles textbook for midwives, it didn't have a picture of a Black woman. They are showing pictures of whites. They show a setup that is completely foreign to the student who is learning. The media portrayal of Africa, I remember in 1984, when I was in high school, we had a really bad famine in Ethiopia, which is just north of Kenya. And, you know, the pictures that then came out of that, and sort of that aid and saviorism that came out, that just denotes Africans as, especially the children, we have flies on our faces, we are dirty, you know, a very negative portrayal of Africa. Racism, I won't even go into that, has always been part and parcel of that. And the plunder, like Quentin has alluded to, of former colonies with vast natural resources results in poverty, lack of infrastructure, electricity, classrooms. So our medical education system is affected by all of this. I lived for a bit in DRC and did projects there with the schools of nursing. DRC is a wealthy, mineral-rich country. It's the third largest country in Africa, the largest francophone country in Africa. It has huge resources of so many minerals, which Professor Eichbaum, you know, alluded to in terms of making our iPhones Coltran and things like that. And in this DRC, the nursing schools literally do not have tables, chairs, desks, blackboards. It's really, really sad. The complete ignorance of Africa and Africans. So what this is now the result is that now there is complete ignorance of Africa and Africans, their way of life, their thinking, their beliefs, their culture. This has resulted in many of us Africans lacking self-esteem, feeling inferior. Then even as we are now in 2021, we've not been able to catch up due to the dominance of the global north in most spheres, which has disadvantaged institutions of learning. For example, the content and pace is set by the West. What and how health should be studied. So you find that at some point, all of a sudden, somebody comes because they have money. I myself have been involved in this in schools of nursing. We had to change the curriculum and say, now add this content, because somebody in the West sat down and said, I think it's really nice to add something that is around anything that is fanciable to them. And so all of a sudden our content changes. Nobody cares about the conditions we face in Africa. You find that there are terms like neglected tropical diseases. In somebody who is actually suffering from this disease, it's very, I would imagine how you'd feel if you're being told, oh, this disease of yours, it's a neglected tropical disease. It's not a big deal. It's not high on people's agenda. But for example, countries, parts of northern Kenya have a lot of some of these illnesses and diseases which are called neglected, and because of that they don't come into the curriculum, we don't learn about them, and yet when we come out to work we are faced with people who have things like Chagas, or with things like, you know, leishmaniasis, or those kinds of illnesses, guinea worm, and so on and so forth. Things like teaching pedagogies where you have, you know, wonderful simulation lab. I've had the opportunity of visiting the Columbia University Nursing School SimLab. It's like state of the art. It's beautiful, you know, and you can't even imagine such a thing here in Africa. It's almost just fantastical. Textbooks, journals, literature cannot be accessed by millions of Africa because we don't have access to electricity, to the internet. So a lot of this information is out of reach. Then the introduction of non-lyrical European languages, such as the English I'm now speaking, and the written text in African schools. So learners simultaneously struggle with language and text, and then this doubles the mental effort required to learn, thus disrupting the learning process. I speak fluently about 3 African languages. Basic, I speak about 2 African languages. I'm now in Rwanda, struggling to learn how to speak Kenya, Rwanda. And then I speak English and I speak Swahili and I have basic French. And many Africans are trilingual, but nobody ever imagines the effect that has in terms of struggling with learning, with understanding. And especially because European languages are very, very far removed in terms of phonetics and syntax with our African languages, which are often lyrical and don't follow the typical European style of teaching. Another, the language again, is that it has contributed to the disappearance of African languages. Language sustains a people's worldview. So if my language disappears, how do I see myself? How do I view the world? How do I view the community I live in? It then replicates societal attitudes to things like black hair, like my black hair, my black skin. Black hair falls at the bottom of the hierarchy of acceptable hair because, they say kinky black hair, and black skin, often even us in Africa now, because of that, we lighten our skin for the same reason. Sorry. The idea of Africa cannot be divorced from the ideology that drove colonization. That thing that, the West is supposedly civilized and Africa is supposedly uncivilized. And this ideology still pervades up to today. What are some of the challenges of global? And I just put this out here. It's by no means exhaustive. And I think for students, as well as for faculty, physical infrastructure, I've already, talked about this, the dearth of physical infrastructure, classrooms, teaching materials, simple things like paper, blackboard, chalk, just the basics, is a challenge. Student selection is a challenge. How do we select students, for example? Who, because of one reason or another, don't quite make the cut to do some of the courses. The bar has been set so high to do things like medicine, nursing, pharmacy, some of our medical laboratory and so on courses. And so if somebody doesn't quite get a B+ or an A or a C, how are they then, do they come into this field of health education? For students, again, applying knowledge and skills, the theory practice gap that you're all very familiar with is a challenge for us, because what we learn in school and what we see out there often is very different, because again, the curriculum has been steeped in colonialism. The lack of absorption on completion of studies, things like, IMF, other conditionalities imposed on governments in Africa. So people graduate, so many nurses, so many midwives, so many doctors, but they can't get jobs. And then, of course, as you know, most around the world, they're increasing numbers because, of course, our populations have increased exponentially. For faculty, when you look at the curricula emphasizing hard skills, again, a carryover from the colonial past where we are looking at hard skills, knowledge, clinical, so you're told, what is this? This is diabetes. How do you diagnose? When a patient presents like this, what do you do? And then these things like critical thinking, communication, teamwork, these are moved and relegated. And then, of course, then this means that we cannot undertake reflective learning. And so our students who come out are almost not able to think. They are rote and they can't think of, and give good care based on the patients who come to them. We also have faculty shortages. Again, this goes without saying. So quickly, I just put a few, thoughts around how can we train decolonizers? And here, this is just, I put this here because I'm a teacher and I like giving definitions, but I'll just focus on the one around coloniality, decoloniality, and colonization and decolonization. And in a sense, when we look at these concepts, decolonization is often seen as time-bound and geographically defined. So things like Kenya as a country was colonized by the British between 1920 to we got our independence in 1963, something like that. Whereas coloniality and decoloniality are ongoing. So sort of like what Quentin mentioned, my mind, is it still colonized? These things are ongoing. How can we train decolonizers? A lot of the knowledge that has come to Africa and that we continue to, to spew out there has been the knowledge of the winners. Universities, all of which we inherited from colonial times, were not interested in the indigenous knowledge, but rather in supporting this knowledge of the North, where the North was portrayed as the knowledge of winners. When we went to school, we always, read in our history books, so-and-so was the first man to see Mount Kenya. So-and-so was the first person to discover the Nile. But the Basoga in Uganda, they were there living with the Nile, drawing water from it. In Egypt, they were there. In Kenya, in the Gems, they lived on the slopes of Mount Kenya. They were there. But, we are told, oh, there was no, it's like, the blacks, nobody cares about you. So the first person to see Mount Kenya, to see ice on the equator was Redman. And then the first person to discover the Nile was so-and-so. So mainly because this Western or these epistemologies of the North had 5 main exclusive conceptions of the world. The focus on Western science. They focused a lot on differences between humans and nature. And Quentin mentioned this with eugenics and that kind of thing, where they were even looking at, between the races. And so blacks were at the bottom. And, they even used to look at and make fun of, the shapes of African, like even African women. If you go down to the South African women, the way we are shaped, we have very big behinds, for example, or that kind of thing. So that was taken as something that's, foreign and inferior. And even some of these people were taken to the West and put in shows and laughed at and things like that. The dominant linear conceptions of time. In the West, there's a conception that time moves in a certain way, whereas in Africa, time is not conceived like that. Time is when we see the sun, and then time to sleep is when the sun goes to bed. And these things of 8 o'clock, then followed by 9 o'clock, and lunchtime is this time, it had a different meaning for us in Africa. Then the universal nature of Western knowledge, that the only knowledge that can be used is this Western knowledge, and any other knowledge, that one is, forget about that. And then, of course, the monopoly of productivity, where again, the focus is always on economic gain, quite different from the way Africans do their things. So how can we then train decolonizers? We can train decolonizers part of a broader institutional strategy. This has to be institutionalized. So you as a person in University X or your faculty in University X cannot do this if the institution as a whole has not bought in. You need to receive input from the community outside the university. You need to open the university to knowledges and people that may have been previously marginalized. We really need to understand our own histories, however difficult they may be. And many institutions in the global North need to accept that they financially benefited indirectly from slavery and the labor of enslaved people. How is our branding? We need to retell Africa's story and history and adequately resource programs. So just as I conclude, what does meaningful engagement look like? Trying to sort of say with Africa at the center. We are saying that we need to work effectively within interdisciplinary team as global health practitioners. So no longer doctors alone, nurses alone, but all of us working together. We also need to bring other non-health practitioners, educators, social scientists, engineers. We need to work towards what I'm calling true partnerships. And these imbalanced partnerships that have caused cognitive and moral dissonance really need to be done away with. And these are just examples. I won't go into that because of time, but we know some of the imbalances where we have, for example, faculty training without engagement and recognition of the national health authorities in those countries in LMIC. We need to develop equitable partnerships. We need to align priorities and research agendas that are driven by the low and middle income country, not by the high income country. And last but not least, this is just an example of one partnership done by the African Leadership University, and I just picked it verbatim. It made the following commitments, and this is something that you can consider for universities. They are saying everything we assign our students will be open source. Commodification of knowledge operates to continue the colonial ordering of the world, where everything can only be got because you have the ability to get this information. A language beyond English, a one-to-one student exchange ratio. Text is not enough. Many African forms of knowledge are not text-based. We cannot work alone. We also need to say that we are producers, not only consumers in Africa. And students must take responsibility for their knowledge, and these harmful colonial practices must not continue to be reproduced. These are some few hard questions as I was putting this presentation for all of us to just take home and think about. For those of us who have come from recovering colonies, which were often violently and bloodily occupied by the Spanish, the British, and so on, what did we as the colonized lose as compared to what we gained? And many times people say, oh, forget about the past. At least we gained some things. We gained some language. We gained education. So did we lose? What did we lose as compared to what did we gain? Did the colonizers actually bring progress? And now, as we are in this field of global health, are we just paying lip service to a movement that is seeking to replace one biased agenda with another different but equally biased one? So this whole global health and decolonizing, is it just a lip service thing? Is it just replacing one old movement with a new one? Again, these are hard things we need to look at and ask ourselves. Those were my references. Colleagues, I thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Caniola and Professor Eichbaum, for your wonderful presentations, and also for leaving us with very difficult questions to think about wherever we are in our careers. We have about 15 minutes left for questions, so I'll refer to the Q&A where you were leaving your questions. And I apologize if we don't get to all of the questions because we have about now 13 minutes. So we'll start with a question from Yaya. In their opinion, one of the legacies of colonialism is also the deconstruction of the role of women in our societies. In their culture, among the Dogon, the place of the woman is very important because the society is very matriarchal. Nowadays, they are obliged to fight to bring a minimum of equity to the profile of women and other underprivileged strata. So all of this was well organized in some cases, not to mention all the traditional and scientific medical knowledge that has been neglected. What are your thoughts about that?
Judy, did you want to take that if you got that as a woman?
I can give it a stab. I completely agree. And, you know, one of the issues around, for example, for me as an educator, and particularly in the field of nursing, is that one of the things that contributes to knowledge is just myself or my being. So if I'm a woman, for example, I will see things from my as a woman. And what you're saying is very correct, that, you know, colonialism came, and because it wiped out everything that was African and said that everything from Africa is bad, this has really been detrimental to some of the philosophy and the theory contribute, you know, to knowledge for us in Africa. So I think these conversations around decolonizing are very helpful because they need to then bring back, you know, what were some of our cultural things that we were doing, whether it's feminist, whether it's patriarchy, whether it's matriarchy, whether it's even things like children, elders, communities, and so on, and some of the things that are important to us as Africans. It's very, very important. But I think also one of the things, in addition to decolonizing, which is colonialism and its issues like we discussed, is also the issue of, for example, the patriarchy, which has also had an effect on us as Africans, and is a whole other conversation that we need to have to then begin to answer that. I hope I've attempted to give you an answer.
Okay, well, our next question is from Emmanuel. He says, colonization happened by war. It aimed to solve economic and social problems in Europe. Europeans still have same needs and more firepower. Don't you think it's utopian to think of decolonizing Africa or so?
Oh, I should hope we're moving away from that way of thinking. But you're right. I mean, a book which Guns, Gems, and Steel by Jared Diamond certainly shows how decolonization happened through superior firepower. But on the other hand, Steven Pinker has written a book, something along the lines of Our Better Angels, showing how overall violence has decreased in the world. It sounds, maybe doesn't seem like it, but generally we've become overall more civilized, and I hope we can keep moving in that direction. I think we need, as the disaster in Afghanistan has just demonstrated, we need to really think more carefully what we're doing in nation building. We so misunderstand other cultures, and this is the arrogance of the colonizers, thinking they have the solutions, they know what to do in another country, and we got it wrong in Afghanistan. And so I think that's a lesson that we will learn. You have superior firepower, the United States, whose military is 15 times bigger than, or bigger than the next 15 militaries, lost the war in Afghanistan against what are effectively goat herders, and were maybe supported by other people, but we lost. Firepower isn't everything.
Thank you. Our next question is from Herika. How can we collaborate with our partners to decolonize our global health curriculum, given the fact that, if they understood correctly, the topic of decolonizing is not being discussed in the global South?
Judy, I don't know, we should both answer that, but you know, the global health curriculum is often written in the North. So, that's the bad side of it. But I don't know how you view the global health curriculum, but it must sound peculiar to people in other parts of the world. As I said, global health is very much a Western construct. And, you know, I gave a couple of pointers. I think, you know, we're setting the agenda, and it has always struck me that what is global health and what are we really doing? But to decolonize a curriculum, I think takes a lot of rethinking, and I think we need to. And this is why I think the humanities are so critical in this debate, because the humanities, and I've been through several disciplines in my career. I think the sciences teach you data and all of that. Epidemiology teaches you how to conduct a clinical trial, but the humanities teach you how to deconstruct the concept, how to think about history differently, how to do, you know, critical consciousness reflection. So I think we need to, many times the global health curriculum is in a medical school, and at least for medical students. Also in other parts of the university, I understand that, but I think we need to bring people, we need to have a better understanding of the historical constraints. We need to teach people how to think about it. We need to look at our own intellectual traditions and bring those into the curriculum much more effectively than we have until now. Judy, what are your views from your perspective?
I think also, in addition, we need to make sure that we are being honest with ourselves and really taking a long, hard look at if this decolonization, as we are calling it, are we really doing it, or are we just giving lip service? One of the things I find challenging, especially here in Africa, is that no money is put into some of these initiatives. So we end up with a webinar like this one where we talk, everybody's excited and energized, and then we just go back to our desks and continue with life. And you know, there's no hard discussion happening around, is there funding to sort of even look at the curriculum and say, how does the nursing curriculum look? When I look at the nursing curriculum, if I'm looking at the midwifery curriculum, speaking from my own profession, or the medical curriculum, like Quentin is saying, what are the things we want to see that are moving towards a more meaningful, true partnership? Like I said, we cannot erase the past. We can't like have it all 100%, but we can try. So some of the obvious glaring things, like, for example, put pictures of Black people, put the skin of a Black person, so that if I look at a bruise, or if I'm looking for a vein, I see how to find that vein on the skin. Let me have this whole misconception that Black people don't feel pain. So these are some of the glaring things that can be removed and put in a way that is actually honest and sincere and accurate. Some of the other things, of course, will take time. Discussions such as these ones are very good, and I hope CUGH is excellent to put this together and let us start thinking. But I want to say, let's put our money where our mouths are.
Thanks. Well, we have the next question is from Michael. He says, is official corruption one of the less desirable byproducts of the flow of aid, as well as of the discovery of oil, as demonstrated in the cases of Equatorial Guinea and Angola?
Oh man, corruption is a whole monster. I'll just say what I think in my view. I think Africa, we got independence, most of the African countries, a mere 60 years ago. 1960s, maybe the first African country was Ghana, 1957. So 60 plus, give or take, years ago. I think Africans, as people, not as the continent or as the landmass, have to move in their minds to a certain place. So we need to grow. And I think that process can take more than the 60 years that we have, where we start being selfless and not selfish. And right now, I always call us, we're in the selfish stage, where every African wants to get as much as they can amass for themselves and the rest be done. And maybe that can be a byproduct of the colonialism, because we are poor. So it's not hard to imagine that if I am Judy and I'm sitting here, I want comfort, I want a nice house, I want a car, I want my children to go to a nice school, I want to live in a nice neighborhood. So I think when we get to a point where more or less we are equal, then you see some of these things of corruption going away. And as we, go more and more, this is sort of my answer to you.
Our next question is from Camelia. What are your thoughts about how to best approach or teach these topics when some US-based middle, high school, and undergraduate programs have abolished or been forced to abolish critical history lessons involving racism, colonialism, etc., effectively wiping them from curricula? Healthcare students might be entering professional school with little or no exposure to these topics.
Yeah, that's a very unfortunate happening, and I know what you're referring to. And in the United States, this has been going on, and people have always tried to abolish history. From my own country, where I was born and raised in Southwest Africa, Namibia, the genocide was literally taken off the books. Someone wrote a whole history of it in 1919, and the South African government decided it wasn't a good idea because it would cause sort of damage race relations. They collected all the books and burned them. Everything was obliterated. You were not allowed to teach it. So don't think this is a new thing. It has happened throughout history. The burning of books and the obliteration of history. Every power tries to obliterate its history. I think, and I'm encouraged by students, you need to stand up and draw attention to it and demand that this go back into the curriculum. It's not going to come from the white sort of bosses who are running the show. You need to demand it and protest. Protest is so important. This is what John Lewis, our civil rights leader, talked about: getting into good trouble. Be prepared to get into good trouble. Don't be intimidated. Civil disobedience takes courage, but it's essential. Everyone thinks their career is destroyed by it, but it isn't. You need to stand up and demand things on your campuses, draw attention to it, write newsletters, write opinion pieces, and that scares the people at the top. That's only one way I can think of it. If it doesn't come from you, it's not going to come from the people in power. The nature of power is it will call the shots. Power is scared when people from below start protesting. So keep up the protests.
Well, our next question is from Margaret. May you both comment on the same process of colonization in South and Central America and its remaining influence on local education and healthcare system?
I didn't hear the first word. Comment on colonization in South and Central America. I can't see it. I can go first there, Judy. I've traveled a lot in South and Central America, and I don't consider myself an expert of that part of the world, but certainly the impact of the United States role over there is not a good one, and how it has propped up one dictator after the next and removed democratically elected leaders, as it did in Africa, for its own purposes. Now, previous talks I've given about this, I talk about the Cold War and its impact on Africa, how the Cold War was fought by proxy in Africa and South and Central America, where the global powers of the North fought it out in the global South. And what the United States did, every person who was communist leaning got removed from power, as it did in Africa. So the impacts are horrific, and we're suffering from them still today. What happened in Guatemala and Chile and places like that, the United States propped up these leaders, and the consequences are there, as they are from Africa. The consequences of what the colonial powers did, and how they, when the Belgian Congo, which by the way was the private property of King Leopold of Belgium, where there was a genocide effectively that by estimates killed probably up to 10 and maybe even 15, 20 million people. When he let go of it and was forced to, so to speak, and the Belgian government took over, they left the country with a global debt of $50 billion. And the Belgian Congo's never recovered. And I think that the so previously called Belgian Congo, and I think the same is with many South American countries, they're struggling. Judy, did you want to weigh in?
South America, I mean, it's similar, I guess, to what has happened in Africa and continues to happen in Africa, where you see the things like the CIA coming in to topple governments and insert puppet masters, and then when people are in favor and when they fall out of favor, and these, weird assassinations that take place that you then later realize were orchestrated by, the global North for one reason or another. The plunder in DRC, I think, is there for all to see. The unfortunate things that are happening in Mozambique, parts of Mozambique, in Libya, the disheartening things we see in Libya, for example, in South Sudan, what happened here in Rwanda. Just the fact that nobody cared about Rwanda simply because we are Black, and we had they said this tiny little country in Central Africa, what part does it play? What role does it play on the bigger, table? And just the things that happen that are just so heartbreaking to see. What I can say, I think it's just so important that we need to shift this narrative and begin to have these hard conversations and change.
I just want to say one thing. Several people have been asking for articles and reading lists. I'm having difficulty uploading them in the chat, but Deepika, if I sent them to you, can you send them to the participant list?
Yeah, so I'll just comment on this. We are going to send out an email that includes a recording and a post-workshop survey. So I'll include the reading list that you send me in that email. So everyone who attended will get that. We're just reaching the top of the hour, so I think that's all we have for questions. I just want to sincerely thank you, Professor Eichbaum and Professor Caniola, for putting together your presentations and engaging all of us in this conversation. And thank you to all the participants for joining us. For those who are students or trainees, if you have any questions about joining the Trainee Advisory Committee or the Campus Representatives Program and continuing or just continuing the conversation, if you would like to ask your questions to the speakers, you can go ahead and email me. I'll put my email in the chat. And then you can get more information about the Trainee Advisory Committee. I'll just put our social media account in there as well. But thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Thank you for participating.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Judy.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Deepika, for organizing.
Thank you both for participating. This was really great.
Thank you. It really was. Thank you.